Talking personally this afternoon is a man who 1 year ago this week was at the peak of his career, and that is quite literally true because nearly 25 years he's made a career out of mountains, photographing them, writing about them, and above all climbing them. And in the process he's become our most experienced expedition leader. But the price paid in terms of friends' lives lost has been high. 3 times he led expeditions to Everest, but never personally made the summit. However, on his 4th visit 1 year ago, he did. He's our grand, but not so old man of the mountains, Chris Bonington. Chris, it must have been a fantastic moment. I mean, that must have been the realization of an ambition, really.
Yes, except, funnily enough, the moment I got up there, there were so many mixed feelings. I mean, the people who I had lost, close friends, all of them associated with Everest, were very much with me in those last few steps up to the top. And I mean, when I got there, I just slumped into the snow and I just cried my eyes out, which I suppose was a mixture of grief, emotion, and you know, it was a kind of positive emotion as well, because there was a kind of terrific feeling of having at last got there, and got there with some really good guys as well.
Yes, it was Pete Boardman and Joe Tasker, principally, who had died virtually on that same spot, hadn't they?
No, they'd been much further down. That was on the northeast ridge of Everest in 1982, but coming up that stretch, the final stretch, Mick Burke actually on the 75 expedition had made that bid for the summit by himself. He was far behind Peter Boardman and Patemba, who were going for the top, and in fact Mick's partner had to turn back because his oxygen set had failed, and Pete and Patemba thought that Mick had turned back, and they'd got to the summit and then were coming back down and were absolutely amazed to bump into Mick, still on his way up. And of course that put them in quite a quandary. What do they do? Mick actually, being a filmmaker, actually tried to persuade them to turn back and go back to the summit with him. It was only about 200 feet, but so that he could film them getting to the top. But you know, at that altitude you don't want to turn back. And so they agreed to wait for Mick on the south summit of Everest. And just after that, the storm broke and it was a total whiteout. And so there I was, plodding exactly those steps that Mick had plodded. And it showed me one thing. I mean, I'm sure that Mick got to the top, and I could see how terribly easy it would have been for him to have just walked straight through the cornice in the whiteout conditions on the way down, and I think that was the explanation.
But when you're up there, Chris, I mean, the sensation must be fantastic. This is the roof of the world. What's the view like?
The view's amazing, but strangely, at the time, I was barely aware of it, but I took the kind of automatic pictures, and it was really more when I got back and actually had the pictures processed, and I could look then, that I could appreciate more what that view is. And it really is the roof of the world, because the closest mountain to you is Lhotse, which is about 27,800 feet high. It's the 4th highest mountain in the world. But from that 29,000-foot eyrie, it's totally dwarfed. And then Kanchenjunga, the 3rd highest mountain in the world, actually sticks out over the horizon about 80 miles to the east, and you've got Shishmapangma, another of the 8,000 meter peaks to the west, but they're all right down. So you've got this perfect 360-degree sweep stretching into the far. It was a beautiful, clear day. So I think one could probably see to the very far horizon, which was presumably about 200 miles away.
But how big is the summit? I mean, can you sit on the edge and dangle your feet over it?
No, it's quite big. There were 6 of us in our summit bid, and you could all fit on. It's about the size of one of those little barroom pool tables, so that you could actually move around it, and without being afraid of falling off. And then it drops it's not like that, it's like that more. And once again, I was so spaced out, I didn't realise it at the time. I clicked away, taking all these expedition group pictures, and there they all were. And it was only when I got back, and once again got the film back, and my wife Wendy picked out one, and she said, "Gosh, do you realise what that guy's doing?" And you look very closely, and you could see, just caught in the light of the sun, a little jet of water. And I sometimes wonder whether, you know, we made a lot of records on that expedition. Had he got the record? Should he be in the Guinness Book of Records for the highest P in the world?
That's lovely. But what is up there? I mean, is there a cairn to say this is the top of Everest? Are there old film cairns?
There was, in 75, when Doug Dougal got to the top, the Chinese had climbed it the previous spring, and they actually did put a marker pole. It was their standard kind of survey pole, and it had a kind of little, almost like a magic lantern on top of streamers. And that lasted for about 5 years. And eventually, presumably, the wind just tore away at the anchoring of it. It was stapled down very well, and it vanished. When we got up there, I didn't notice it myself, but one of them did. There was some paper prayer flags actually just trampled into the snow. And I think that probably was from the previous year when the mountain had been climbed in the autumn.
Apart from that, though, because there's quite a lot of debris on
Lots
Everest,
of people,
isn't there?
sadly, yes. I mean, lower down, I mean, for instance, the South Col, I'm afraid, is the highest junkyard in the world, and it is dreadful, actually. I mean, there's 172 people have reached the summit of Everest, which means that probably something like 600 people have actually reached the South Col. They're all using oxygen bottles. And it's a huge area. It's the size of a football pitch of just grey, slaty rock. And over this is all the debris of the previous camps, remains of tents, food boxes, and empty oxygen bottles, multi-hued. And it is ugly. But, I mean, we were just as, I mean, I can't, be sanctimonious. We were as guilty as anyone. You're so totally knackered when you get up there. You just haven't got the energy, the strength to take it down. And then there's this collective effect. Because it is such a junkyard, you feel, well, adding a couple of bottles don't make any odds. And then all the way up to the top, there are, I'm afraid, there are reminders of people having been there. You see the odd fixed rope. We saw some rope coming up the east face of Everest, which the Americans climbed about 3 years ago. There's a little bit of rope going up to the south summit that the Yugoslavs had climbed a year ago, and so on. But those aren't too intrusive. They're just tiny little bits of rope, and it's quite nice, a companionable reminder that someone had been there before you.
It does raise the question, though, which I've often wondered about. I mean, you have equipment now for climbing, which was not available to people in decades gone by. How far will you go in using mechanical aids to help you to get to the summit of a mountain?
Well, there's a kind of constant interplay, really. But what has happened with the improvement of gear, which, funnily enough, is not some of the very obvious things. One of the most important improvements of gear has actually been in outer fabrics of clothing, especially a thing called Gore-Tex, which actually does breathe, as well as be waterproof and windproof. And this kind of thing has meant that climbers can actually stretch themselves to much greater limits. The introduction of alloys, so you've got super lightweight crampons, super lightweight carabiners and everything else, titanium and all this kind of stuff. And therefore, your climber can do even bolder thing. So at one stage, you've got perhaps oxygen equipment improving. Though, funnily enough, the oxygen equipment we were using on Everest in 1985 was not one jot better or more efficient than the oxygen equipment that Ed Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing had. But so you've got at one extreme a party like us, which was actually using all the aids to get up. And I mean, I certainly needed every single little bit of help I could get. But at the other extreme, you've got guys like Reinhold Messner, who was the first man to climb Everest without oxygen with Peter Habler, who are saying, well, no, we will do without all these aids. And he then went on, of course, to solo Everest from the north. An incredible achievement, 3 days up, 2 days down, completely by himself. But using he was able to do that partially through a knowledge of modern diet, nutrition, lightweight equipment, and so on. And then also in other parts of the Himalayas, you've got the most adventurous parties, once again cutting down on modern aids and climbing the mountains alpine style, travelling very, very light. So they're able to make an even greater commitment, so that what they're doing actually is even bolder, say, than what those wonderful guys in 1924 did, who went up to very nearly to the top of Everest. And of course, it's just conceivable that Mallory and Irvine did
actually
reach the summit. Yes.
Yes. If you more often than not, put it that way, if there's an expedition going and you're on it, you'll be the leader of it. Certainly in recent years, that's been the case.
Not on this one, though.
No, that's right. You're taken up by the Norwegians, he was. But are you a sort of born organiser, Chris?
Not really, no. I mean, I think I became a leader by default. I suppose I started off well in that I went into when I left school, I hadn't got the faintest idea what I was going to do, and I went into the RAF to do my national service. I just failed A-level English, which is pretty good for a person who's going to become a writer. And I then liked the life and suddenly found out that this was fun and I suppose adventurous and everything else. I originally wanted to be a pilot, and so I went to Cranwell. And I'm a useless driver, and I was an even worse driver of aeroplanes. And so they said, well, look, there's no way we'll ever make you a pilot. And I then transferred to Sandhurst. I felt that, you know, if you couldn't be a pilot, I didn't want to be in the RAF. And I went into the Royal Armoured Corps in charge of tanks. But I think what I learnt an immense amount in just being in charge of a little group of squaddies in the Royal Armoured Corps, in the Royal Tank Regiment. And that was to be of great value later on. Then eventually I left the army, hadn't got the faintest idea what I was going to do at that stage either, and finally kind of drifted really into freelance journalism. And then we'd been talking about going to the Himalayas, climbing a mountain. I'd been on a couple of Himalayan trips as a member of a team. And finally, I realized that we were all talking, but nobody ever did anything. And so, someone was going to have to do something if we were going to get this show on the road. And so I got the Annapurna South Face expedition started, and as its leader, and then got into, Everest Southwest Face and everything else, once again as the leader.
When you were an officer in the services, were you a good officer, do you think? I mean, could you have made it a career?
I think I was a good officer. I think when I left Sandhurst, I think I made every mistake in the book. I was incredibly arrogant, and I'd done well at Sandhurst. I was a junior under officer and passed out 16th or something. But I was over dictatorial with this troop, and in fact the Armoured Corps is very different from the infantry. It's rather like being actually a tank crew. It's like being a kind of an Alpine-style expedition. And you can't actually run a tank crew with the kind of standard military discipline and the military rule book. You actually have to establish a friendly kind of atmosphere where the team works because it wants to work together and work well. And I think I learned that. And then I had 2 years at the Army Outward Bound School as an instructor. And I think I was good at my job as an instructor. But I don't think I'd have done well if I'd stayed in the military hierarchy. I think I'm much too much of an individualist.
Right. The next thing is how do you get into mountains? Because here's a young lad brought up in Hampstead. Now, Hampstead's not the centre of mountains in the world. How did you become interested in the business of mountains?
Well, this was, we're not totally coincidence. I went off, my parents had split up when I was very young, so my mum had to bring me up. And as a result, of course, as any one parent family had the big problem, what on earth do you do with a youngster in the holidays when she was out working? And so I got sent off on all kinds of adventure holidays, which I think were a good start. And I started by cycling and using the youth hostels and going on long cycle tours. And then I started walking a little bit. My grandfather had retired to Dublin, and he lived just outside Dublin. And I had some holidays there, and you could see the Wicklow Mountains from his back garden. Oh, God, it'd be nice to go and climb them. And so I went off and walked in the Wicklow Mountains by myself without a clue how to read a map or anything, and found it immensely exciting. It was terrific. And I just noticed that there were mountains, when you take the train to Holyhead, I noticed there were these mountains on the way to Holyhead. So I thought, God, it'd be nice to go and climb them. And I hitchhiked up with a young school friend at the age of 16. And here, my mum was terrific, that, she never ever kind of over-sheltered me, over-protected me. And I can imagine how I'd react, actually, if our kids at the age of 16 wanted to go and hitchhike somewhere. And she let us do it, and we got avalanched off snow, and it was a very kind of cold winter, rather like this one. And I was just totally hooked, and I met a couple of climbers, and I couldn't get in the youth hostel that night, and nor could they. So we stayed in a little bed and breakfast, and they just talked climbing. And I imagine they were in their early 20s. And I was 16, I just sat kind of totally gobsmacked, by what they were saying. And knew that was the thing I wanted to do more than anything in the world.
But when you were a boy, were you climbing trees and all that sort of thing? Were you adventurous in that sense?
Oh, yes.
Always scaring the daylights out of yourself and your mother?
Yes, I was, because of the war, well, first, even before then, at the age of 3, I was always tree climbing. I ran away from home with a little girlfriend at the age of 4, and we wandered over Hampstead Heath, and were finally, in fact, found by a policeman, brought back to his to the Hampstead police station office. I mean, I was a total horror, and so anyway, we found all his bottles of milk. So we emptied all the bottles of milk over his desk. I mean, I must have been a fiendish child. I think I was actually sent to one of these, kind of psychiatrists, for problem children. And then when I was sent to boarding school during the war, very young, because once again my mum had to earn a living in London and she wanted to get me out of the bombing. And I kept running away from there, not because I was unhappy at the school particularly, but just like I enjoyed roving and wandering, so it started young.
Yeah. But this business of frightening yourself, you see, there obviously were occasions in your youth when you did frighten yourself silly. Is that really what is at the basis of climbing mountains? Are you sort of trying deliberately to frighten yourself to find out how far you can go?
Not quite, but I think the risk factor is very important. I think the key thing in climbing, the excitement in climbing, is not frightening yourself. It's going into a risk situation, and in rock climbing I think it's where it's at its most simple and actually it's most elating. And I mean, if you could imagine, you're on a sheer rock face, you're clinging by your fingers and your hands. Certainly when I started climbing, you might just as well have been climbing solo. I mean, climbing in the early 1950s, I had an ancient hemp rope that, I mean, there's a question even if the second came off on it, the rope might have parted, and if you fell off on it, out in front, you'd have broken the rope for certain. And it is immensely exhilarating, but the exhilaration is to be a master of that dangerous situation, and the most incredibly satisfying, exciting, euphoric moment is when you've managed to do a really hard series of moves and you've got complete mastery over your body, and they've been hard moves, so yes, there's been a kind of titillation of fear, and I think there is an addiction. You get, I think, addicted to this adrenaline surge, and I think then over the years I need that kind of climbing. If I haven't been climbing for several days, I get withdrawal symptoms and I get crabby and bad-tempered.
But you see, the way you describe it, I mean, you are pushing yourself to your limits, are you not?
Yeah.
If you go a fraction too far, doesn't it become a suicide bit?
Well, I suppose it can do to a degree. I mean, the rock climbing actually is pretty safe, and especially, I mean, I rock climb. I use, the equipment's improved immensely. You have hundreds of little kind of nuts and camming devices that you jam into cracks, so that in actual fact if you fall off, you're most unlikely to fall more than a few feet. But when you get into the Himalayas, I think the risks are frightening. I mean, if you just look at the statistics of my last few expeditions, on our Annapurna South Face expedition, there were 8 lead climbers. These are, guys who'd expect to go to the summit and were pushy, ambitious climbers. Well, of those, 5 are now dead, including Don, but at least Don died in his bed of a massive heart attack from years of wonderful good living.
Don Williams?
Yes, but still young. I mean, he died and is, just 2 years older than me. But the other 4 all died, so that's 50% of the team died in the mountains. Of the Everest expedition, the 75 expedition, there were 10 lead climbers, but of those 10, 2 have really, fairly shortly after the 75 trip, stopped serious, necky kind of Himalayan climbing. So out of that 8, 4 are now dead. If you take with Doug, he went to the top of Kanchenjunga, very bold climb, in 1979. Of the 4 in that team, 3 are dead. Shishma Pangma that Doug climbed, another 8,000 metre, 3 went to the summit, 2 are now dead. I mean, those kind of statistics are very, very frightening, and it is the dangers of high altitude climbing.
And yet you yourself, you see, you've been doing it for all these years, and you've had one serious fall, Chris. And what did you break? A wrist and a couple of ribs or something?
Well, no, just actually damaged a nerve in the wrist. No, just 3 ribs. But no, I've been very lucky, and I mean, it is luck. I mean, one of the I've had lots and lots of narrow escapes, as Doug has. I mean, he's actually exposed himself to risk even more than I have, because he goes out, I mean, 2 or 3 times a year on big mountains. I keep it to 1 expedition a year.
What happened that time? That was on the Ogre, wasn't it?
That was on the Ogre, and it was a very steep, difficult mountain. It was immediately after the 75 Everest expedition, and whereas in the 75 trip we'd been a huge expedition, this was Doug's expedition, and it was in a style that all of us liked the idea of, and Doug invited just 6 of us. We're going off to climb this mountain, and we were going to climb it in separate pairs, all do our own thing. And it ended up with Doug and myself together, and we went for the summit. We had Mo Antoine and Clive Rowland in a snow cave about 500 foot below the summit. And we got to the top just as it was getting dark, and on the very first abseil on the way down, Doug slipped, and the rope was at an angle like this, and if you like, he's like the blob on the end of a pendulum.
Right.
And in the dark, he didn't see there's a bit of ice there, hadn't got his crampons on, so doing, and he did this terrific swing, smashed into the rocks, broke both legs. He used his legs as buffers, so he had his legs right up. And if you can imagine going like that and clamp, you go. And that saved his life, probably. If he hadn't done that, he'd have damaged a lot more.
But after this, how did you get down, Chris?
Well,
Because
Doug had to crawl down. Well, we had Mo and Clive immediately below, so they were able to help us. We went, and everything went wrong. It always does, you know. You take one liberty, and everything had been very light-hearted until that moment, and the weather broke. There was a bad storm. We had to climb over another summit before we could even start getting down. It took us 6 days to get down. We ran out of food on the first day, so we went 5 days without anything to eat. On the 3rd day down, I slipped. In fact, well, Doug slipped again, actually. He went right off the end of the rope. And so he was hurtling down and to a 2,000-foot drop. And at the top of our line of fixed rope was about 30 feet below him in this gully. And as he zoomed down, the rope was across, so he grabs it. And that saved him. I was actually still on the end of the rope. The next person down actually tied the end by that time. And I just kind of fell about 25 feet. But unfortunately, I landed on a spike of rock and broke my ribs. And it was the worst epic I've ever had, but we all got out of it.
I tell you, the person that I, in a sense, admire almost more than you, I think mountaineers' wives must be quite extraordinary people. Did Wendy know what she was letting herself in for when she married you?
Yes, I mean, they are. I think they've got, if you want courage, they're the people who've got the courage. I mean, we're just silly, irresponsible fools, basically, who've never quite grown up.
Do you feel that, really?
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, it is a pretty silly thing to do, to go climbing. It's very important to me. But no, I think I don't think there's a bad thing, actually, being a little bit immature and having a little bit of the child in you. But yes, you're playing games through your life. But it's very, very difficult to equate that game playing, which is terribly important to me, with a responsibility to someone whom I love very, very much indeed. And I mean, love and risk game playing are they're incompatible, and there's no explanation. But getting back to Wendy, I think, yes, not only did she know what she was getting into, she was marrying a climber, but at that time I was at the very most important turning point of my career in life, in that I was working for Unilever. After I left the army, I had 9 months as a management trainee with Unilever. And at that time, I had a short spell. I was selling margarine in Hampstead.
Just cutting across that, because we're going to be short of time in a moment. What about the 2 boys, you see? Because their father is disappearing off to all sorts of corners of the world to do these mammoth expeditions. And what do they think? Are they interested in climbing at all? Did they worry about their father?
Oh, they definitely worry about me. I mean, when I announced I was going back to Everest again, I think they were even more upset than Wendy was, and said, "But you promised, Dad, you know." And they don't climb, either of them. Daniel climbs a bit, but not really. And I think I think any youngsters of parents who are very much in the public eye, no doubt your children, Have you gotten it?
I've got them, but I don't climb. I don't
Well,
put
no,
myself
but you're
at risk
still
like
you're
you do.
well known, and you're in the public eye, and I am. And I think they've had a rough time because of that at times. And I think that they both definitely want to kind of lead their own lives and do something that's completely different.
Well, it's, I think, fairly obvious from what you've been saying, Chris, that the only thing that's going to stop you from climbing would be sheer old age and inability actually to get up a slope on a mountain. So
I hope that's a long way away.
That's what I was going to say. I think it must be a long way away. Whatever happens in the future and whatever climbs are ahead, may they be peaceful, may they be happy, and may they be safe. Chris, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.